You want to be an IT pro, so you must have all of these tools. Remote monitoring.
The big takeaway from our i5 6600K and i7 6700K revisit was that the 4-core 8-thread 6700K is still capable of keeping up with modern games, while the 4-core 4-thread 6600K is showing its age and benefits more from an upgrade. This means that we have to travel even further back in time to find a generation of Intel Core Series CPUs that definitely need to be replaced. Since some of those 6000 series chips are still perfectly fine for simple gaming, today we're shifting our focus to the Haswell refresh, Devil's Canyon, which shipped with an enthusiast overclocking slant. We'll be rebenching the Intel i7 4790K and i5 4690K in stock and overclocked configurations, although owners of the 4770K and 4670K can follow along pretty closely. Before that, this video is brought to you by Linode Cloud Computing. We've trusted Linode as our web host since 2012 and recommend it for excellent technical and customer support, reliable uptime, and a clean interface. Aside from cloud hosting, Linode.com recently added GPU hosting plans for machine learning and neural net use, built with RTX 6000 GPUs and 10 gigabit per second network speeds. They're also starting to deploy EPYC CPUs in their servers. Sign up for Linode.com Cloud Computing with code GNEXUS20 for a $20 credit, or click the link in the description below to visit linode.com/gamersnexus. Haswell was one of Intel's longer-lived generations. It launched in 2013, and it remained in Intel's desktop CPUs with the 2015 Devil's Canyon refresh of Haswell, where you had the, well, add 20 to the SKUs. 4770 becomes the 4790, and the 4670 became the 4690K. These had a bit of an enthusiast slant more than typically, and actually I remember sitting in the meeting, and I think it was San Francisco just after GTC or something, where Intel was addressing the talking point of improved thermal paste under the IHS versus solder, and what they were planning to do for Devil's Canyon and how it was better thermally and all of that stuff. So that point was still active at that time for the 4000 series. But this remained active all the way through the HEDT-only Broadwell generation and all the way up to Skylake's release in 2015. And we already covered the 6000 series with a revisit. If you have one of those chips and want to see how those do today, the i5 4690K and i7 4790K Haswell chips, though, the refresh, were the pinnacle of gaming, just like the 6700K was at the time, and made a lot of sense to buy if you were gaming only. This was also in peak an i5 is enough for gaming season, which we were a part of because it was. An i5 was great for something as simple as GTA 5, which actually came out pretty late towards the end of the 4000 series and around the beginning of the 6000 series, with the 6700K actually getting benchmarked in GTA 5 when we first reviewed it. So all the way up through that time, and even with some of the games that came out afterwards, an i5 was perfectly fine for gaming. Today, that's changed. We don't really recommend them anymore. An R5 3600 would be our cheaper choice for that. So the 4690K, we need to cover some prices, had a launch MSRP of $243. The 4790K had an MSRP of $339 to $350, according to Intel's ARC database. One of the considerations here with these revisits is if you're on an older i5, like a 4690K, can you sell it for more than it's worth? And the answer is, well, based on what's out there, probably yes. And then can you buy a 4790K for more than it's worth? Ideally, just like with owners of the 6600K who might want to get one last push out of their motherboard and their RAM before being forced to upgrade all of it, you would hopefully be able to find something like the i7 variant of your i5 for $50. But that's not really particularly common, unfortunately. So it does make a full upgrade of everything more likely. And for that, we'll be comparing the MSRP of the time versus chips in roughly the same price category today, with some looks at the 9700K at the very high end. But the prices don't line up perfectly. The i5 9600K is about $20 cheaper than the old i5, and the i7 9700K is about $50 more expensive than the old i7. The 9900K is more in the spirit of the 4790K, but it's way more expensive, approaching $500 for that one, and is sort of entering HEDT territory, even though it's not technically. As for AMD, the closest price analogs are the 3600X or the 3600 in the $190 to $210 range now, and the 3700X or 3800X in the $330 to $350-ish range, respectively. Those aren't the Ryzen CPUs we typically recommend, the 37 3800X that is. We like the 3600 a lot for what it does, and then we kind of like the higher end ones. But they're currently on sale for competitive prices, and that might make them worth considering if you're trying to buy in the same price category as your old i7 purchase was. Let's get into the benchmarks now. We'll focus on gaming stuff for this one. We've got a couple production benchmarks in there, but not as many as normally because, well, frankly, you're probably not running a lot of those workloads on these older CPUs. And if you are, you can look at some of our other recent benchmarks to see production workloads for modern CPUs. So we'll start testing and see how the 4000 series keeps up in basically 2020. Shadow of the Tomb Raider with DirectX 12 is our first game. We'll start with 1080p gaming, but we'll add 1440p shortly. Not that it really matters when you're this CPU bound. The 4790K managed a very playable 107 FPS average in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, including frame times that supported playback without detectable hitches or stuttering. This is a game that was released in the same year as Intel's 9000 series CPUs, making it significantly newer than the era of the Intel 4000 CPUs. Overclocking brought the 4790K to 122 FPS average, a gain of 13% over baseline, and perhaps more importantly, pushed the 0.1% lows above 54 FPS to 63, improving frame time consistency. Its most modern replacement, the more expensive Intel i7-9700K, blows past it without even an overclock, landing at 166 FPS average, while the AMD R7-3800X averaged 144 FPS average, also respectable. Moving to the 9700K grants a considerable improvement in average FPS of about 55%, with the 3800X offering an uplift of about 34%. The stock i5 4690K scored much lower at 73 FPS average, but the 4.6 GHz OC helped with a 26.6% uplift to 93 FPS average. The i5 9600K destroys its older counterpart and almost halves the average frame time, yielding a frame rate of 144 FPS average, with an overclock raising that to 158 FPS average. Tomb Raider greatly benefits from the extra 2 cores on the newer CPU, although we still don't necessarily recommend the 9600K on average. The R5 3600's 138 FPS average yields a stock-to-stock improvement of 88% versus the i5 4690K anyway, although that's reduced to about 51% when overclocking the older i5. Still, AMD is on the map as compared to its lackluster 4000 era offerings, which might as well have not existed, and also got AMD successfully sued into a settlement. The 4690K is getting embarrassed by even the AMD R5 3400G, and the i5 6600K would have granted meaningful uplift as well if you had waited one more generation, but you'd be upgrading still, so it doesn't really matter. Hitman 2 with DirectX 12 is our next title. At 1080p, Hitman 2 averaged 64 FPS average on the 4690K and 95 FPS average on the 4790K. 0.1% lows are always terrible in this test, but the 4690K dipped to an especially unpleasant 18 FPS for the 1% lows. In contrast, Intel's current gen i5 9600K averaged 113 FPS, with 1% lows at 53 FPS, due in no small part to its additional 2 cores and threads. The other modern preferable upgrade for i5 owners would be an R5 3600 or 3600X, which averaged an even higher 115 FPS thanks to additional threads and modern architectures. The 4790K is similarly outclassed by its modern components. The stock R7 3800X averaged 26.5% higher at 120 FPS average, and the stock Intel i7-9700K averaged 48.5% higher at 140 FPS average. Overclocking rarely offers significant benefits in this title, and boosting the 4790K to 4.8 GHz caused a minor 3.1% increase up to 97 FPS average. Overclocking won't fix everything on these Devil's Canyon parts. The 4690K bucks that trend though with a 19.3% uplift with a 4.6 GHz OC, picking up some of the